This past week, I was trying to come up with some of the best TV shows of the last generations, and I started to look on the internet, because that's where we go to find these answers nowadays. And I'm like, maybe I can find a list. And I was finding lists that I just wasn't satisfied with. Like, apparently the number one watched show ever is Game of Thrones, which I 100% reject, because I've never seen Game of Thrones. And I doubt any of you have seen it. And if you have, don't feel bad. Like, it's a fine show, or I don't know if it's fine. A lot of people watch it. But you have to have HBO, and it's just not easy to watch. It's not on network television. So I rejected those lists. I finally found one that had some different shows by generation, or by decade. And I think that some of you will resonate with this. So this is some of that came up. So one of those shows was I Love Lucy. Another was Cheers, Seinfeld, Friends, The Cosby Show. I saw on some lists The Flintstones. I think another one was the one Space Family that was a cartoon. The Jetsons. Yeah, I'm too young to have known that. Sorry. I know about it. I don't know if I've ever seen an episode. Was it what? I have that one here in a minute. So Andy Griffith. So I didn't see Andy Griffith on there. I also didn't see Happy Days or The Brady Bunch. I know those shows were some that my family liked to watch on that one channel on Dish that showed TV Land, maybe, the older shows. But here's some that I remember loving as a kid. Home Improvement. I actually remember these being popular. It doesn't mean I watched all of them. Another one was The Office, The Big Bang Theory, How I Met Your Mother, and then one that I really like, Parks and Rec. So some of those I liked, some of those I just remember being popular in the 2000s and early 2010s. Now here's the thing about all these shows. In the ones, like I said, the Brady Bunch, Happy Days, Andy Griffith, that didn't actually make the list for whatever reason, even though they're super important shows. Basically, I'm sure we could all sit here and talk about shows we loved that I've never heard of or that we've forgotten. But what is it about these shows that make them so beloved? What is it? I think there's one thing that makes them beloved, no matter what the show's about. Even if it's a show about a post-apocalyptic zombie land world, there's a show called The Walking Dead that Megan and I watched for a while that was about that. You watch those shows because of the relationships, the characters and how they related to one another, the relationships that you formed with those characters. Because here's what is true about humans. We tell stories. And in these stories, we develop characters. And these characters then reflect relationships. And so we relate with characters and we relate with their situations. And it becomes a way of seeing our life through somebody else's world. Now here's the problem with that. Sometimes, and it's not always bad, when we write these stories, sometimes the stories and the characters do things that maybe we would say that's not the best decision. That's not a model behavior. But when we have media and we have stories that are told to us, like on TV or in movies or in books, part of what you have to be able to do is discern, well, what is the way we're supposed to live? What is the ideal type of relationships we should be striving for? Now, some people would say, well, we need to look to our culture and try to find the best of our culture, and that will help us know the kinds of relationships we should strive for and what those should look like. Now, what do you think I'm going to say? We're here today. We're getting ready to read from Colossians. I'm going to say, let's look to the way of Jesus. Look to the Word of God. Let's see what Paul and Timothy have to say about this in Colossians. So in Colossians, and we'll be in chapter 3, verse 18 through 4:1, Paul and Timothy are going to tell us that our relationships are shaped by the way of Jesus. Let me say that one more time. Our relationships are shaped by the way of Jesus. So if you want to open up to Colossians 3:18 through 4:1, in the Pew Bible, it is on page number 1679. And it will be on the screen. 1679, if you want to follow along in here, it will be on the screen. If you want to follow along in your own Bible, it's Colossians 3:18 through chapter 4:1. So let's take a look at this. Well, actually, before we look at it exactly, I want to remind us, it's been a little while. We've been going through Colossians for about, I think this is my seventh or eighth sermon. So that's around 2 months, but then also we had last week where I didn't preach. So we've had a while. So Colossians has been challenging us, and basically the center of it's been making the way of Jesus central to our lives. Remember, Colossians is a letter written to this city called Colossae by Paul and Timothy, and they're trying to help these young Christians in this city of Colossae figure out how to be a Christian and how to live the way of Jesus in their city. And so it's a very practical letter. And what Paul and Timothy keep saying is that you need to make the way of Jesus central in your lives. They talk about being rooted and built up in the way of Jesus. They talk about not just catching Jesus, but remember, running with him. It's not about saying yes, it's about living with him. They talk about making the way of Jesus our priority. And then the most recent sermon, the passage was about taking off their old lives, like you take off a coat or a costume or a uniform, and then putting on the way of Jesus. And that becomes our daily driver. And so the question is, how do we then live the way of Jesus? And Paul and Timothy said this in the last section. Over all things, these virtues. And over all these virtues. You remember the verse before, there was a list of virtues. They said this: put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. So what Paul and Timothy are saying is like, look, if there's one question you need to have about, or one answer to all your questions, it's love. Put on love. Love shaped by the way of Jesus, which means love that's self-sacrificial and seeks harmony and hope and reconciliation, that seeks to put others first. So that's what they call us to. But now what Paul and Timothy are going to do is they're going to apply this to the household. Now, what we're going to look at is called a household code. There's about 2 others, I think, in the New Testament. There's 3 total, I believe. This one, Ephesians, I think, and then one in one of the other letters. So in the ancient world, it wasn't just Paul and Timothy writing household codes. There were Greek philosophers and people who taught how to live a good life in the broader ancient world, and they would have household codes. And these codes were how a household should operate if it wants to operate well. And so it was wisdom. So Paul and Timothy, they are wanting to make Christianity legitimate. They were wanting to try to help these Colossian Christians figure out how to live in their families as followers of Jesus. And so they give them a household code. So before we look at this, 2 important rules. 1, we should not assume that everything that they say applies to our situation in exactly the same way. This is so important because in the past, Christians have read these and assumed it's like, oh, this is just rubber stamped for all times and all places. That's not what's going on. Paul and Timothy are trying to help the Colossians figure out how to live in Colossae. That's the reason why every household code is slightly different, because they're all written to different peoples. And number 2, we should not expect them to address issues we think are important in our own time and place. So we can't say, okay, well, why don't they talk about this? This is so important to us. Well, because they aren't talking to us. But there is important information that we can learn about living from this code. So let's take a look. This is how it starts. 3:18. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. So this one right here is the first one that gets Paul and Timothy in trouble. People read this and they get upset. Remember, we need to look at this from the lens of the first century. So in the first century, it was just assumed that wives had to submit to the head of the household. So the head of the household in the Roman world was the man, the husband. But also there were situations where women who were specifically wealthy, who were married to a wealthy husband, actually did not have any legal obligation to their husband. They had it to their father. So sometimes the father of a wealthy family would keep authority legally over his daughter, even though she was married into another family. And so we don't want to assume that this is just like the man's always in charge. It's not like that. It's like the head of the house. And so that could have been somebody other than anybody in your family. If you're a slave, it means everybody in your family has to look to the head of the household. But for wives, you look to the husband. But what's important that Paul and Timothy say that really turns things upside down, even in the world of Christians, because what Christians want to say is, wives, submit to your husbands because husbands have been given authority over wives. That's what they want to say. Does that say that here? It doesn't say anything about husbands. It says, wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Now that's a weird way of saying living the way of Jesus and living love, wives, for you just means submitting to your husbands. Because what Paul doesn't want to do is create chaos. Remember, he's trying to help these Christians figure out how to live in their families. And so he says, wives, don't be overly difficult. And what he means by that is, this is, I think, the scenario you think about. A wife who is a Christian and her husband isn't. And so it's a wealthy family, and the wife is a Christian, so she starts to host the church in their home. This is how it worked. We see in the New Testament, there's stories of women who are very wealthy, and they are following Jesus, and their husbands aren't that interested. Even if you watch The Chosen, there's a story about that. And what Paul is saying is, don't let that create tension in your household. Don't be pushing your husband too much. Just try to respect one another. And remember that he is the head of the household. But you do it not because of your husband's authority, but you do it because you are living the way of Jesus. And that's an act of worship. Now, before anybody gets upset, Paul has words for husbands too. Verse 19. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. And so now Paul turns to the husbands and he says to them, just like wives submit, husbands are to love. Now, this is the love we're talking about. That is love that's self-sacrificial. Love that puts others first. Love that seeks harmony. Love that seeks reconciliation. That is not the kind of love that was valued in the Roman world. Definitely not in the marriage relationship. You would not find any ancient author telling husbands to love their wives. They would say, yes, you need to care for your wife. You have an obligation to provide for your wife, as in, don't neglect her to have the things she needs, like food and shelter. You have that responsibility. But they don't say anything about love. But husbands are called to love their wives. And then Paul and Timothy add this other line. Do not be harsh with them. Now, this is a weird, and that's not really actually a good translation, because really the idea is don't have something that will spoil the relationship. And so basically, husbands, don't do something that will spoil the relationship with your wife. So in the same way that Paul says to the wives, don't turn over what's that phrase, like spill the apple basket? I don't know. Don't do something to upset your spouse if it's not necessary. Husbands, don't do anything to upset your spouse. You have a responsibility to seek love. And so Paul's really trying to say both parties have a responsibility to put the other person first. And this is what the Christian teaching on it today often misses. It says to husbands, you have all the authority. They say you do have responsibility. Now, if we were to go to Ephesians, which Paul also wrote, it says the very first thing, and if you read the wrong translation, they actually take this part out and they put it in the section before. It says, submit to one another like you submit to Christ. Submitting to one another and submitting to Christ is what Paul sees as the center of relationships. Our relationships are shaped by the way of Jesus. We are following Jesus first. And so it means our relationships are shaped a certain way. So we need to put aside all of the words that are used here about submission, because that was the first century. In today's world, husbands and wives are treated equally in the law. They each have equal footing. In Indiana, it's 50-50. But no matter what all of that says, what we need to do is put the way of Jesus first. So in the first century, another relationship that was common that we can relate with is the child-parent relationship. So this is what Paul and Timothy turn to next. Verse 20, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. So parents, you might want to have this in your back pocket so you can pull it out. I would say don't do that after you read the next verse. In this place, Paul and Timothy say to children, obey your parents. Now that's just a standard first century thing. It's assumed that children are under the authority of the parents. Now, we have a lot more respect for children than the ancient world. The ancient world didn't really view children as legally anything until they become adults. So it's a different world that we live in where we value children. And really, we have to thank the church for that, because Christians later on in the early centuries would find abandoned babies which is perfectly legal to abandon a baby, and they would take them in and raise them. And that's why we value children. So Paul says, look, children, obey your parents, but look why he says to do it. For it pleases the Lord. In the similar way as what he says to the wife, it's not about authority, it's about this is what you do when you're seeking the way of Jesus. And so parents are to have authority over children, and the children are to obey. So I will say to the kids in the room, when you listen to your parents, it's an act of worship. So I see my kids here. But then Paul says this to fathers, but to parents. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Now, the reason he says this to fathers is because, like I said, in the first century, the father, but specifically the head of the household, had the legal responsibility over even adult children. So adult children in the home had to defer to the head of the household. And I would say even adult children out of the home, like you were not supposed to do something that would bring shame on your family and dishonor your father. And while your father was living, he was deferred to authority in your family. And so this relationship is really important. But Paul says to those fathers, and I would say to all parents, look, you have the power in the relationship, so you have the responsibility to not cause the problems. And as a father, this is something I struggle with. I can be the one to set the bomb off in the bad situation. If I would respond differently, it would all be different. But sometimes I don't, and it causes chaos. And that's what Paul and Timothy knew. They knew that the parents have the responsibility to make sure that things go well with their children. And so he says, don't embitter them. Don't do anything that's going to cause your children to be discouraged. So I think about the fathers who are never satisfied, or the mothers who always have something negative to say. Our relationships are shaped by the way of Jesus. More than anything else, our kids need to know they are loved. If they don't know it, if they don't feel it, it doesn't matter what we say. And I would say this goes not just for families with kids and parents, but I would say with the whole congregation. Think about what we do when we baptize an infant. We say that we will be with the parents in seeing that child raised in the way of Jesus. So for all of us, when we see the kids in our midst, do they first and foremost know that we love them? Because if they don't know that first, it's very easy to discourage a child and put them in a position where they aren't receptive to what you might have to say. Or they might not think that they really matter that much to you. And all they're going to be trying to do is prove to you how much they do and live up to your expectations. And that's why parents, the first thing we say is, I love you, no matter what. No matter what you do. You don't have to earn my love. You don't have to earn my I see you, and I care for you. Our relationships are shaped by the way of Jesus. And now there's one more relationship structure that is completely foreign to us. And this is the one that gets Paul and Timothy in the most trouble. Let's take a look. Verse 22. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. So this has been used as a weapon. It was certainly used as a weapon in our own country, in the South, before slavery was made illegal. It was used to justify slavery. Now let's think about what's going on here. This is the first century. Most of the Christians in the first century were slaves. So even, like I said, that scenario where there's a wealthy wife who becomes a Christian, and so they start hosting a local community of Christians that is called an ecclesia, a church in their home. there's slaves probably in that household. And those slaves are probably becoming Christians too. And so Paul is not trying to be an idealist. Paul is trying to help these Christians figure out how to live in the first century. And so he says to slaves, like he says to wives and to children, the people who have less power in the relationship, he says, don't cause trouble. Obey your master. But like with wives and with children, look what he says. He says, don't obey your master because they have authority. He says, don't do it when you can get their favor. Do it all the time. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as you work for the Lord, not for your human master. And then look what he does. He puts a time bomb in the slave-master relationship. Paul does. We can use the words of Paul, and the early Christian, or the Christians in the abolitionist movement in America did use the words of Paul to dismantle slavery. Look what Paul says. Since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward, it is the Lord you are serving. And then he says this, anyone who does wrong will be paid with wrong. Jesus sees if your master mistreats you, there will be justice. You will have an inheritance in the kingdom of God because you are a person who is part of the people of God. Now here in a moment, Paul has words for masters. But he says to slaves first, obey your master and do it as an act of worship to Jesus. Now, I think a way to think about this is if you came to me and you were very troubled, you had a boss that was difficult. Now, would it be helpful advice for me to say to you, just make their life horrible as an employee? Is that going to help anybody's situation? Now, I understand it's very different. As an employee, you have rights. As an employee, you can walk away. But we're talking about human interpersonal relationships. And Paul is saying, look, if you follow Jesus, you can live the love of Jesus, and you can show that to your master because our relationships are shaped by the way of Jesus. And so he says to slaves, do all in your power to show your master that you are working not just for them, but for the glory of God. But then Paul says this to masters. 4:1. Masters, provide your slaves with whatever is right and fair. Look what he says right here. This is a time bomb in the master-slave relationship. Because you know that you also have a master in heaven. Now here's the thing about Colossians. We're pretty positive that Paul wrote Colossians and then he sent it with a slave named Onesimus. Onesimus was a slave who belonged to a man named Philemon in Colossae. Onesimus had run away, met Paul, become a Christian. Paul sends him back to Philemon with Colossians, this letter, and also with another letter from the New Testament you might have heard of called Philemon. Philemon is a letter from Paul to this man who owned Onesimus. And in that letter, Paul all but says, I want you to let Onesimus go and give him your freedom, or give him his freedom. And then I want you to let him to come back to serve me. Now, we don't know for sure what happens. We do know that there's an early first century bishop named Onesimus. We don't know if it's the same person. But these are the sorts of things that when people say that the Bible supports slavery, when you read Paul, he all but says slavery is an earthly institution that has no footing in the way of God. Even earlier in this letter, it says there's no Jew or Greek, slave or free. All are one in Christ Jesus. Right here, Paul says to masters, look, you need to be fair to your slaves because you have a responsibility to care for them. Because look, you actually all have one master, God in heaven. You are all equal before God. So even though you might have a piece of paper that says you own that person, you don't. You have a responsibility to see them as a brother or sister in Christ, to treat them as such. And remember that all of us are equally yoked to the way of Jesus and to God as our master. Our relationships are shaped by the way of Jesus. And so this letter, these words, Philemon, some other places in the New Testament, give us all the language we need to say slavery is wrong, it is wicked, and it should be eradicated, which is what has happened over the last, 1,500 years, 2,000 years. I mean, there's still slavery today that happens. But the reason we can say it's wrong is because of these words. So we don't have slave-master relationships, but we see that in those relationships, the same idea remains strong. Our relationships are shaped by the way of Jesus, which means they're shaped by his love, seeking harmony, reconciliation, self-sacrificial love for others, peace. Those are the kinds of things that we should be looking for. Being a Christian is about taking off our old lives, rooted and built up in the world, and putting on the way of Jesus, which is rooted and built up in Jesus. So for the Colossians, this meant that their households were to take a certain look. Our households are different today, but I think the same principle remains. Our relationships are shaped by the way of Jesus. And so you want to know how to have a relationship with others? Let that be shaped by Jesus and his love for you. So it doesn't matter what relationship we find ourselves in. We are people who are called to see others as equal before God. We're all equal in Jesus. We can't control what other people do, and we don't have the right to say that we have authority over others, because we don't. Yes, parents have a legal and parental authority over their children, but it doesn't mean that we can make them do whatever. Like, we need to give them guidance, we need to have expectations, but we can't make somebody do anything. We have to help them learn how to do that and to want to do it. That's why parenting is so difficult. And that's why the communities that have the children who are the most forced into a certain mold, those are the children that explode the most when they're free. Maybe some of us have known people like that. They become free and then become wild. Because we can't make anybody do anything, but we can help shape their relationship by the way of Jesus. So those who find ourselves in marriage relationships, we must remember that those relationships are shaped by the way of Jesus, which means they're shaped by self-sacrificial love. For those of us who find ourselves in a parent-child relationship, we must remember that those relationships are shaped by the way of Jesus, which means the parents have the responsibility of putting self-sacrificial love at the center. But children, you have a responsibility as you're able to learn to obey your parents. And as children become adults, that relationship, that responsibility becomes more shared. I don't want to say adult parents and adult children, like it's all on the parent still, because I don't think it is anymore. There is an equality. There might still be respect, and there might still be that you are my parent, but children also have a responsibility. I mean, parents, you can do all you can, but you cannot make your child respond. But children, and we're all children, our relationships are shaped by the way of Jesus. And then for all other relationships, the rules are the same. So we don't have slave-master relationships, but we have all kinds of other relationships in our lives. Co-workers, employees, employers. Maybe you are a part of groups in the community where you have friendships and other connections. All of those relationships are supposed to be shaped by the way of Jesus. The Christian life, it is really simple. It doesn't take a lot of words to say, live love, live the way of Jesus. And I think all of us can kind of say, I actually get what that's about. I can understand what it means to live the way of Jesus. Now, what's hard about the Christian life is doing it. It's about letting the way of Jesus be there when we're frustrated, when we're angry, when we're losing our cool. But we must push forward, because when we make the way of Jesus our priority, when we run with Jesus, when we build our lives in him, that's when we find the true life. That's when we thrive. And it all comes down to our relationships are shaped by the way of Jesus.